Cowboy's aging father lay dying alone. A starving drifter nursed him and gained a home. The bread tin was empty. I already knew that, but I opened it anyway, the way you do when you're hungry enough that knowing a thing isn't the same as accepting it. Tin lid, tin smell, nothing. I set it back on the shelf and looked out through the one window of the lined shack that still had glass, and what I saw was the same flat brown earth I'd been looking at for 6 days. I'd come across that lined shack the way a half-drowned man comes across a floating plank, not because I'd chosen it, because it was there and I wasn't dead yet. My name's Elias Creed. Was a time that name meant something in 3 counties, or at least I told myself it did. 48 years old that autumn, which I know because I'd been keeping track of my birthdays even when I had no one to tell them to. A man holds onto some things. Birthdays, names, the sound of his mother's voice from 40 years back. The important things rot away. The small things stay stuck. I'd left Cimarron County in the spring with $11 and a horse that was already going lame. By the time that horse gave out south of Tascosa, I had $2.40 and 1 boot that had split at the welt. I walked on that split boot for 9 days. You stop feeling it after a while. The body does that, stops sending you the news when the news is all bad. The lined shack was on a ranch I didn't know the name of. I'd knocked and no one answered and the door wasn't locked, so I'd gone in and that was my crime, I suppose. I'd found some dried corn in a sack, a tin cup, a rusted stove that still worked, and 4 walls. I'd been there 6 days. The corn was gone on day 3. I opened the bread tin a second time, because I am a man of poor judgment, and that's when I heard the horse outside. Not a drifter's horse. The sound was different, a horse that knew where it was going, that had weight behind it, not just bones and want. 2 horses, I realized, listening, and a wagon by the creek. I put the bread tin back on the shelf carefully, like I hadn't just been hoping something had appeared in it by miracle, and I went to the window. The wagon was stopped maybe 50 yards off, a woman on the seat. Small, maybe 40, wearing a brown coat with the collar turned up against the November wind. She was looking at the shack the way a person looks at something they're not sure is standing or falling. I could have gone out the back. There wasn't a back door, but I could have gone out the side window. I'd done worse. But I stood there instead, and then she looked straight at the window and saw me, and I'd missed my chance. She didn't spook. That's the first thing I noticed. Most women alone would have pulled up the reins and turned the wagon. She sat there looking at me through the glass for a long moment, then she climbed down from the wagon seat. Slow and careful, like a person who was tired but not weak. I went to the door and opened it before she knocked. She looked at me. I was not a sight to inspire confidence, split boot. A week's worth of beard that had come in more gray than I remembered, eyes that probably looked like 2 holes burned in a sheet. She looked at all of that, and her face didn't change much. "You been here long?" she said. 6 days, I said. "I haven't touched anything of value. There wasn't any." "I know," she said. "I stocked that shack in August. Whatever was here you already ate." "The corn," I said. "I ate the corn. I'm sorry for the corn." She looked at me another moment. "Have you eaten today?" "No. Yesterday." I thought about it. Some water. She went back to the wagon, and I stood in the doorway and watched her, thinking she was going to drive off and wondering whether I would try to stop her, deciding I wouldn't. She pulled a cloth sack out from behind the seat and came back. Biscuits in the sack wrapped in a piece of flannel. Cold, but they were biscuits. She held the sack out. I took it. I tried to do it slowly, but I don't think I managed. "Eat," she said. "Then I need to ask you something." I ate 2 biscuits standing in the doorway. They were cold, and they were the best thing I'd tasted since I couldn't remember when. She waited. Didn't watch me eat, which I was grateful for, looked off at the plains instead. "The ranch house is 4 miles north," she said when I'd slowed down some. "The man who owns this land is in that house, has been in it for 3 weeks without moving much. He's got a fever that won't break, and a wound in his side that I've done everything I know how to do for, and it isn't enough." "I'm not a doctor," I said. "I can see that. No meanness in it, just plain. I need someone who can lift him, turn him, sit with him through the nights so I can sleep some. I've been doing it alone." She paused. "I can pay you, or I can feed you, or both. I can also let you stay until you've got yourself together enough to move on. You're choosing." I looked at the empty bread tin through the open door behind me. The split boot. The planes that went on without end in every direction. "What happened to him?" I said. His son's ranch hands came through in October. Dispute about water rights that's been going on since the summer. Things went wrong. One of them had a knife. She said it all flat, and even the way a person says things they've turned over so many times in their mind, the feeling has mostly worn off of them. His son is out looking for the men who did it. Has been for 3 weeks. Doesn't know how bad his father is. I've sent 2 letters, and I don't know if they've found him. And you are, I said. His daughter-in-law, she said. Margaret Lyle, the son is my husband. He left me here to manage. She said that last part without bitterness, which I thought was a kind of remarkable thing. She just said it like a fact of weather. Elia's creed, I said. She nodded like she'd registered it, and we'd see. I'll come, I said. The ranch house was bigger than I'd expected from a spread that only ran 1-line shack with no corn in it. 2 stories, stone foundation, a porch that wrapped around the front. Solid, but the kind of solid that comes from years of stubbornness rather than easy money. You could see it had been patched in places, added to. A man's life's work pressed into boards and mortar. The old man's name was Amos Lyle, and I didn't learn that until the 3rd day. The first time I saw him, he was in a back bedroom on a rope bed, covered with 2 quilts and a coat on top of that, and he was still shivering. Face the color of old tallow, eyes closed, breathing through his mouth. Bigger man than I'd expected from the way Margaret moved around him, careful and brisk. When he breathed deep, you could see the shoulders of him, the width. Not gone to fat, but just big. Spent his life working, and the work had made him solid, and the sickness was working to undo all of that, and losing. The wound was in his left side, below the ribs. She'd cleaned and packed it, and it was holding, but the fever was what was eating him. Had been eating him. She showed me what she needed. She showed me without embarrassment, which I respected. Some women would have turned it into a whole thing, a man she didn't know, a strange man handling her father-in-law. She just showed me how she turned him, where she put her hands to brace him, what she did with the wet cloth for his forehead. Every hour or so if you can, she said. If his breathing changes faster or if it stops for a stretch, you come get me. I'm in the room at the top of the stairs. Where do I sleep? I said. She looked around the room for a moment. There's a chair, she said. There was a chair, a wooden chair with a cane seat that had seen better decades. I pulled it up beside the bed and I sat in it, and that was my post. The first night I didn't sleep at all, which was fine. I'd spent enough nights awake in enough worse places. I sat in that chair and I watched Amos Lyle breathe, and I cooled his forehead every hour the way she'd shown me. He didn't wake up that night. Made sounds sometimes, shifting around in the fever, saying words that weren't words, or words in an order that didn't add up to anything. Once he said a woman's name, Clara, and his face went through some change that was hard to look at. Private in the way that a person's face gets private when they're saying things they think no one can hear. I turned him at midnight and again around 3 in the morning. Not an easy job for one person. He was long and heavy, and none of it was cooperative. I worked slow and careful, and I managed, and I sat back in the chair after, and my lower back was speaking to me in terms I hadn't heard in some years. Around 4 in the morning, he opened his eyes. They were gray eyes, and even in the fever they had something in them that didn't look like defeat. He looked at me for a long time. I could tell he was trying to work something out. "You're not Curtis," he said. His voice was a ruin, a voice that had been loud once. "No," I said. "Curtis is your son, I'm somebody else." He blinked slow. "Margaret hire you." "More or less." He seemed to consider that. "She's been managing all of this alone," he said. "She has." "Good woman," he said. Then he was gone again, back under the fever. The second day Margaret made eggs, and I ate 4 of them, and she didn't comment on it. She looked rested, meaning she'd gotten 5 hours instead of 2. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had done all of this every day for years. The water, the stove, the eggs, without wasted motion, without cheerfulness put on for my benefit, without anything performed. I'd been around performed women, and I'd been around real ones, and she was the latter. "He woke up for a minute last night," I said. She stopped moving. "What did he say?" "Asked if I was Curtis, talked about you a moment, said you were managing all of it alone." She went back to the eggs. Something moved through her face and then was gone. "He's been feverish 3 weeks, she said. He's not always aware of how long." He seemed aware for that minute. She brought the eggs to the table and sat across from me. "Eat," she said. I ate. She had coffee, which I hadn't had in long enough that I'd stopped thinking about it, and she poured me a cup without asking. I wrapped my hands around it and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't come out sounding like too much. How long have you been on the road? She said. Since spring. Before that? Ranching, I said. Cimarron County. Had a lease on 400 acres that I ran cattle on for 11 years. Lease expired and the owner sold to someone else, and that was that. Nothing to show for 11 years. About $60 and a lame horse, I said. She looked at me across the table, not pitying, which I was grateful for, just looking. My husband's been gone 3 weeks, she said, like she was answering something I hadn't asked. 3 weeks, and the letter I sent him may not have found him, and in the meantime his father may die, and I don't. She stopped, let a breath out through her nose. I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't been in that line shack. Someone else would have come along. Maybe, she said, but you were there. She got up and took her cup to the window and looked out. I ate the rest of my eggs. The fever broke on the morning of the 4th day. I was in the chair when it happened, and I almost missed it because I'd been asleep for what I think was maybe 2 hours, head tipped against the wall, and what woke me was the silence. His breathing had changed, gone quieter. I sat up and looked at him, and his color was different, still bad. But the waxy yellow had shifted toward something more like a man rather than a thing that was becoming less than a man. I put my hand on his forehead, and the skin was wet. Damp, which meant the sweat was back, which meant the fever was breaking. I went to the stairs and called up, Margaret. I heard her feet hit the floor almost before I finished saying her name. She came down in her nightgown and coat, hair loose, and I moved back from the doorway, and she went to him, put her hand where mine had been, stood there with her hand on his forehead, and I watched her face change, not dramatic, not tears, just a long, slow release, like something that had been braced against a weight was finally allowed to straighten. Yes, she said, to no one in particular. She sat down on the edge of the bed. I went to the kitchen and built up the stove and put water on, because she'd need it, and because I needed somewhere to put myself. Amos Lyle came back slow. That's the way of fever, it doesn't leave all at once. It retreats and pretends to come back and then retreats further. For 3 more days he was in and out of sleep, eating broth when he could keep it down, sometimes talking and sometimes not. Margaret was with him most of those hours, and I took the night watch still, and we moved around each other in the kitchen and the hallway without much friction. The broth she made was a thing I hadn't seen in a while. She built it up from bones, beef knuckles she had in the cold larder, and she simmered it most of a day with an onion and a piece of dried chili that had been on a string above the stove. The house smelled of it. Not the smell of sickness anymore, which had been in the walls for weeks, but something warm and actual. When she strained it into a clay cup and carried it to him, I saw him close his eyes over the first spoonful, and she watched his face the way you watch a thing you have put care into and are afraid to trust. He drank half of it the first time. She finished what he didn't. I noticed she did that, finished what he left, not from waste, but from hunger she didn't make a thing of. She was feeding 2 men and herself on what she had, and she did not complain about any of it, and I tried to eat less than what I wanted, and I don't know if I always managed. The 3rd morning after the fever broke, she put a plate in front of me and said, "Eat all of it," without looking at me. So she'd noticed I was holding back and she didn't want it. I ate all of it. On the 7th night after the fever broke, he was awake and talking. Really talking, not fever talk. I came in to check on him around 10 o'clock, and he was sitting up against the headboard with his eyes clear. "Sit down," he said. I sat in the chair. He looked at me, same measuring quality as the first time he'd opened his eyes, but now with the mind behind it working properly. A man taking a true account. "Margaret told me about you," he said. "There isn't much to tell," I said. "She says different." He shifted, winced, pressed a hand to his side. "She says you sat in that chair 9 nights straight, that you turned me when she couldn't get me turned, that you ate corn out of a rusted tin for 3 days before she found you." 6 days, I said. The corn ran out after 3. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. 6 days, and you were still there, didn't run off with anything. Wasn't anything worth running with. "My horse is worth running with," he said. I had nothing to say to that, so I said nothing. He looked at me a while longer. Outside, the wind came up, and the house creaked at the joint where the addition met the original walls. That particular sound old houses make when they're settling into the cold. "I owned this land 40 years, Amos Lyle said. "Came out here with nothing and a stubborn streak and built something. You know what that takes." "Some idea," I said. "Costs you things," he said. "Costs you people, first my wife. Then years with my boy. He was raised by this land more than by me, I think. You give things to a place and you give them away from somewhere else." He paused. The telling was still an effort. "Got to the point where I thought that was all right, that the land was enough, that a man didn't need more than what he could put his hands on." He stopped for a long time. "I didn't try to fill it." "Then you get a knife in your side in your own yard," he said. "And your son is 3 weeks out chasing men who aren't worth chasing. And there isn't a soul in this house but your daughter-in-law, and then one morning a drifter in the spare room." "I'm sleeping in the chair," I said. "Not anymore," he said. "Spare room at the end of the hall. I asked Margaret to make it up this morning." I looked at the floor, looked back at him. "You don't know me," I said. "I know you stayed," he said, "when you were hungry enough to run and tired enough to fall and had nothing holding you here." He said it plain. No sentiment, no extra weight put on it. Just a man saying a fact the way a man says a fact. That tells me what I need to know about a man. It was another 3 weeks before Curtis Lyle rode into the yard. In those 3 weeks, I found out the shape of the work that needed doing. Amos couldn't do it yet, and Margaret was running a house and tending the recovery, and the ranch didn't stop needing for any of that. There were 12 horses. There was a barn that had a roof section beginning to fail. There was a fence line along the eastern boundary that had come down in the October weather and hadn't been repaired, and the neighboring cattle were finding their way through. I did not ask Amos's permission for any of this. I just started doing it. On the third morning, he sat up in bed and watched me through the window. I was working on the barn roof, and when I came in at noon for water, he said, "You done that kind of work before?" "I've done all kinds of work," I said. He nodded once, like that settled something. I fixed the fence over 2 days, working alone with posts and wire and cold, stiff hands. The wind on that second day was something. I wore every piece of clothing I owned, which wasn't much, and worked until I couldn't feel my fingers, and then I kept working. The fence held when I finished. I rode back on the best of Amos's horses, a gray quarter horse who knew her job, and I put her up and fed her and went inside to the spare room, which I was sleeping in by then. And I laid down on a real bed, and I thought about nothing for a while, which is a luxury not everyone knows the value of. Margaret brought food to the room that night because I hadn't come down for supper. She knocked and came in with a plate and set it on the little table by the window. "You should have stopped," she said, looking at my hands. The knuckles were cut from the wire a couple of places, nothing serious. "They'll be fine," I said. "I know they'll be fine." She sat down on the edge of the chair. "I mean, you should have stopped when you couldn't feel them. You can't work if you damage your hands." "It's a fence, not a piano," I said. She looked at me a moment. "Eat," she said. I ate. She stayed, which surprised me. Usually she left the plate. She looked out the window at the dark yard. "You haven't asked for anything," she said. "You said you'd feed me and let me stay," I said. "You've done 3 weeks of work worth more than that." I didn't say anything. She turned from the window and looked at me. The lamplight was low. I'd had it turned down so I could see out, and in that light her face was tired in the bone-deep way of a person who's been carrying something for a long time. But there was something steady in it, too. The look of someone who has decided not to be broken by the things that haven't broken her yet. "Amos wants to talk to you tomorrow," she said. "About what?" "About what comes after he's back on his feet," she said. "About whether you plan to leave." She looked at me long enough that it wasn't a neutral look. Then she took the plate, I'd cleaned it, and she went out. Curtis Lyle came home on a Thursday. I was in the barn when I heard the horse. I came out and saw him coming in through the gate, a man somewhere in his mid-30s, built like his father but not yet with the weight of years behind it, and his face was a man's face that had been out in hard weather too long and hadn't had enough sleep. He saw me and he stopped his horse. We looked at each other. "Who are you?" he said. "Elias Creed," I said. "I've been here 3 weeks." He looked me over the way a man looks over someone he's deciding about. "Doing what?" he said. "Whatever needed doing," I said. "Your father's been sick." Something moved across his face. "How sick?" Better now, I said. He's in the house. He got down from the horse and handed me the reins and went. I put the horse up. The animal was wrung out, you could tell by the hip bones and the dull coat that he'd been ridden hard for weeks without enough rest or feed. I watered him slow, the right way, and grained him and put him in the end stall with extra bedding. His feet were tender on the left front. I looked it over and it wasn't bad, but it wanted watching. I noted it. Then I sat on a hay bale, and I thought about what was happening in that house. A son finding his father at the far edge of something and pulled back from it. A wife who'd kept everything together while her husband went chasing across the territory after men who'd wronged his family, which was the kind of choice a man makes that neither he nor anyone else can fully account for. The weight of that meeting, all the unsaid things in it. I'd been a stranger in that house for 3 weeks, and I knew the shape of some of those things, and I thought about whether I was going to be in the way of what needed to happen in there. Then I thought, there's a horse in this stall that needs more work than I've done, and I got up. I didn't go inside for a few hours, gave them the room. I finished what I was doing in the barn, and then I walked the fence line along the near pasture, checking my repair, checking the rest of it. The light went gray and then blue, and then the stars came out, and I stood at the far corner of the property and looked back at the house with its windows lit. A house with people in it looks different from a house that's empty. You can tell from a long way off. I thought about Cimarron County, about the lease, about the 11 years, about the bread tin in the line shack. I thought about Amos Lyle saying, "You stayed." I walked back in. They were all three at the supper table when I came in. Margaret at the end nearer the kitchen, Amos at the head, out of bed for the first time in the evening, which Margaret had been working him toward for 3 days, and he looked like it cost him something, but he was doing it. Curtis across from the empty chair on the long side. Curtis looked at me when I came in. Then he looked at his father. Something had passed between them in those hours I'd been outside. You could see the shape of it without knowing the words. "Sit down, Elias," Amos said. I sat down. Margaret put food on the table. Beef, which there hadn't been in the 3 weeks I'd been here. She'd been saving it, maybe, for when there was something worth eating it for. Potatoes, biscuits. I thought about the cold biscuits in the cloth sack the first day. That flannel wrap. Curtis said, "My father tells me you found him when he was 3 days from dead." "Your wife found me," I said. "I was in your line shack eating your corn." "You been there 6 days?" Curtis said. "Yes." He looked at me, young enough that it still showed on his face when he was working through something. "The men I was after," he said. "I found 2 of them. The third one," he stopped. "The third one is still out there." "I'm sorry," I said. He looked at his father. Amos looked back at him with the gray eyes steady. "I was gone 3 weeks," Curtis said. "Chasing, my father was here dying and I was chasing, if you hadn't been in that line shack." "But I was," I said. He stopped, looked at me. "I was in the shack," I said. "Your wife had the sense to stop and ask. Your father had the constitution to hang on. Nobody has to figure out what would have happened if any of it had been different." Curtis was quiet. He looked at the table and then at his father and then at Margaret. She was looking at me. "I'd like you to stay on," Curtis said. "As a hired hand, full wages, room." "I already have the room," I said. "Full wages," he said again. I looked at Amos. He was looking at me with the look of a man who has decided something and is waiting to see whether another man is going to be foolish about it. "All right," I said. That winter came in hard. Even for that country, that winter came in hard. 3 separate stretches of cold that dropped to nothing and stayed there, and snow that meant we were cutting hay and feeding horses before the sun was up and after it was down, and all the hours between. Curtis was a good man to work beside, once I figured out how he liked things done. He didn't waste words, and he didn't expect you to, and he worked as hard as he asked anyone else to work, which is the only thing that matters about a man when you're working. There's a kind of communication that happens between men doing hard labor that doesn't use words and doesn't need to. You learn a man's rhythm. You know when he's about to lift and you're already lifting. You know when he wants to stop and you're already stepping back. By February, Curtis and I could work a morning on the water lines, breaking the ice in the stock tanks, running new pitch on the joints that were cracking in the freeze, without saying more than a dozen words across 3 hours, and everything that needed saying got said. Amos watched all of this from whatever vantage point he'd found for the day. He was getting his strength back, but he didn't push it, which I think cost him something. A man like that. He'd been his own best hand for 40 years, and now he was the one watching. I don't know how he managed it as well as he did. Some days you could see it on him when he came in from standing on the porch in the cold, the particular frustration of a man whose mind still knows what his body can't yet do. But he never made it other people's problem. The evening walk started in January. He came out one night when I was doing the last check, and he fell in beside me, and that was that. We'd walk the barn, check the horses, check the water lines, check the fence at the near end. He'd put his hand on a post or a wall the way you put your hand on something you built, not to test it, but to know it's still there. Then we'd go in. Margaret would have something on the stove. Curtis would be back by then if he'd been out. One night in February, deep cold, walking back from the barn, Amos said, "Clara used to say this land would kill me." "Your wife," I said. She said it like a fact, not a complaint. She knew what she was marrying. He looked up at the sky, which was clear and absurdly full of stars the way it gets when the cold drives everything else out. She wasn't wrong. It'll kill me eventually, but she was wrong about whether it was worth it. I thought about that. She didn't think it was worth it, I said. She thought it was, he said. That's why she said it like a fact and not a complaint. He pulled his coat closer. Knew what I needed, let me have it. That's a different thing from agreeing with it. We went inside. Margaret had coffee on. That's the shape the days took on. February, a Sunday, I was in the barn mending harness by lamplight, and Margaret came in. She didn't usually come to the barn in the evenings. She stood in the doorway a moment, and then came over to where I was working and sat down on a hay bale across from me. And she had her coat on, and her hair was pinned up the way she pinned it up when she was going to town. Only we weren't going to town. "Amos was asking me today," she said. "About what?" I said, not looking up from the harness. "About whether you were happy here," she said. I put the harness down, looked at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know," she said. "I told him I thought you might not know yet either." She looked at her hands in her lap. "You don't talk about yourself much." "Nothing much to say," I said. "You said that before," she said, "and I didn't believe it then either." We stayed like that a while. The horses shifted in their stalls. The lamp made a sound that lamps make, a thin sound. "I had a wife," I said. "A long time ago, 8 years before the ranch. She died in childbirth, the child too." Margaret didn't say anything. She just looked at me steady. "After that I worked," I said, "because you have to do something. 11 years on a ranch that wasn't mine, and I pretended it was, I think, in the ways that counted, and then it wasn't even that." I picked up the harness again and set it back down. I think I'd stopped expecting anything. "And now," she said. I thought about the spare room at the end of the hall, the gray quarter horse who knew her name and came when I came to the fence, the coffee in the mornings. Amos Lyle walking beside me in the cold without needing to fill the silence with anything. The feeling of work that meant something at the end of the day. "Now I don't know what to expect," I said, "but I'm not done expecting." She looked at me for a long moment, something in her face that I didn't try to read all the way. "That's enough," she said, "for now." She got up and went back to the house. I sat with the harness and the lamp for a while longer. Spring came late that year. March went out cold and April came in like it hadn't decided. But there was one morning in the middle of April. I remember it sharp because I've thought about it since, where the weather broke overnight, and I came out of the barn at 6 in the morning, and the air smelled like mud and new grass and something else you can't name. Just the smell of a world that's been through something and decided to keep going. Amos was sitting on the porch. Not a chair, he'd put a crate out there for something, and was sitting on the crate with a cup of coffee, looking at the land. I came up onto the porch and stood beside him. He handed me his cup without looking at me, and I took it and drank and handed it back. "Been thinking," he said. "About," I said. He looked at the land. The light was that particular April light, gold and watery at the same time. The grass was starting to come in along the near fence, where the slope held moisture. You could smell the cattle from the far pasture, the particular warm smell of them in the morning. "I've been thinking about that line shack," he said. "All right," I said. 40 acres around it. Good 40 acres runs along the creek. I've been holding on to it because I kept thinking I'd graze it, but my grazing days may be behind me and my son has enough of his own to manage. He drank from the cup, handed it back to me again. I was thinking I'd put a proper building on it, small, solid. A man could work those 40 acres. I held the cup. I'm not in the business of charity, he said. I know you're not, I said. Work for what you need to get started, he said. Deed at the end of 2 years. I'll draw it up proper. Curtis has seen worse arrangements. I looked at the land, the grass coming in, the light on all of it. I'm not going to tell you I didn't feel something. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't the kind of thing that does something to a man's chest when it comes at him after the years have done what they do. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there with the cup and the morning, and I thought about 40 acres and the creek I'd seen from the window of the line shack, silver in the distance, and I thought, yes. All right, I said. Amos nodded. The day we started clearing the site for the building was a Saturday in May. Amos couldn't help with the heavy work, but he directed. Curtis came over with one of his hands. Margaret came too, which I hadn't expected. She brought food, which I had expected. But she also brought a square of paper with a drawing on it, a rough floor plan she'd made, with a note in her handwriting on the side. Room for a proper stove, room to put things. I looked at the paper, looked at her. You'll need a kitchen, she said, matter of fact. I know I'll need a kitchen, I said. And windows on the east side, she said, or you won't have light in the mornings. I'll be up before light, I said. Then you'll want to eat breakfast with some light, she said. Trust me on the windows. Curtis was watching this exchange from the far end of the cleared ground, and not hiding that he found it interesting. We started on the foundation that day. I worked beside Curtis and the hand all morning, and at noon Margaret laid out food on a blanket on the ground, bread, cold meat, apples, and we sat in the May sun and ate. Amos sat on a folding stool he'd brought and ate his bread and looked at the creek and didn't say much, which meant he was satisfied. After we ate, Margaret walked to the edge of the cleared ground with me and looked at the rough lines I'd marked for the walls. This is a good piece of land, she said. I know it, I said. She was quiet a moment, looking at the creek. Then she said, without looking at me, when my husband's father was dying, I went to that line shack for the first time in 2 years. I hadn't been out that far since the year before, when things were easier. I didn't expect to find anyone in it. I know, I said. I don't believe in providence exactly, she said, but I believe in being where you're supposed to be. I looked at the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she looked at the land with a proprietorial kind of attention, like someone who had earned the right to see it clearly. I was 6 days in an empty shack, I said. And I found you there, she said, and I needed you there, and Amos's son has him still, and you have, she gestured at the marked ground. This. I didn't say anything. She turned and looked at me. Direct, the way she'd looked at me through the window of that line shack the first time, the look that didn't spook, didn't retreat. You're a good man, Elias, she said. You were good before any of this. You were good in the hungry days. I want you to know that I saw that. Something happened in my chest that I'm not going to try to describe in any more detail than that. You couldn't have known that, I said, when you found me. I could see it in how you were standing, she said simply. Some people try to look like less trouble than they are. You just stood there and let me look. She looked away again. I knew. The building went up through May and into June. I did most of the work myself, evenings and days when I wasn't needed elsewhere, Curtis's hand coming over to help on the big days when you couldn't do it alone. Amos came out every few days to look it over and make his observations, which were always right and occasionally irritating, which is the nature of a man who knows what he's doing telling another man who also knows what he's doing. He told me the foundation stones wanted to be set deeper on the north side because of the frost heave in that ground. He was right, and it cost me 2 days. He told me the ridge beam was slightly off plumb. It was off by less than I could see, but I reset it because he was right about that too. He told me I was overcutting the window frames by a hair, and that a hair was enough to let the cold in. I measured again, and he was right again, and I didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and we left it at that. Curtis came one Saturday with his hand, and they helped me raise the walls on the east side, which was the day I'd been waiting for. There's a point in building something when it becomes real, stops being a thing in your head, and becomes a thing you can stand inside of. That was the day when those 2 walls came up and we pegged them at the corners, and I stood in the shadow of them and felt the wind break differently around me. That night I slept at the work site. No reason to exactly, I could have ridden back. But I put my bedroll on the new floor and lay there with the roof half done above me and the stars through the gaps, and I didn't sleep much. Just lay there and felt the boards under me, my boards, and listened to the creak. I hung the windows on the east side. The building was done by the middle of June. Not finished the way a townhouse is finished, rough-hewn, the floors planked and gapped in a couple places I'd get to in the fall, the stove set in but the flue still wanting some work. But it was mine. 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, a door that swung true. I stood in it the first evening alone, in the last of the June light, and I thought about the bread tin. I thought about how a man can get to the place where he opens an empty tin twice, not because he thinks something changed, but just because he hasn't yet made his peace with how empty it is. I thought about how long I'd been in that place without knowing it had a name. I thought about a woman standing in a doorway in November, not spooking at what she saw. There's a thing that happens to a man who goes long enough without being needed, long enough without someone expecting him to show up and do a thing right. It doesn't announce itself. You don't notice it arriving. You just look up one day and you see it's been going on for a while, the way you've stopped expecting things, the way you've started moving through days sideways, taking up less room than you might, trying not to press too hard against anything in case it moves or breaks or makes you feel how long it's been. I'd been doing that for years. I hadn't known it was what I was doing. She'd seen it in the way I was standing, that's what she'd said. And she'd handed me biscuits in the cold and asked me to come anyway. And I had. And here I was in a building I'd built on land that was becoming mine, with 40 acres of creek bottom and a gray quarter horse in the pasture, and a man 4 miles up the road who talked to me evenings about the cost of things worth having. I thought I didn't earn this, I just stayed. Then I thought, maybe that's what earning looks like sometimes. Just staying where you're needed, doing what's in front of you, and trusting that a good woman knows what she saw when she looked at you. The last of the light went off the boards, and the room went dim, and I lit the stove. The deed came through in the way Amos had said it would. 2 years, which we were a long way from yet, but the paper was drawn and signed and real, and I had a copy in the tin box I kept on the shelf beside the stove. Not the bread tin. A different tin, a good one. That first fall on the property, I was out mending the north fence line. Always the north one, that stretch didn't want to hold. When I heard a horse and looked up, and it was Margaret, coming across the grass on the gray quarter horse I'd been working since I arrived. She pulled up and looked at the fence, looked at me. "You're going to spend half your life on that fence line," she said. "Probably," I said. She got down and tied the horse to a post and came and stood beside me. And we looked at the fence the way you look at a thing that's honest work and you both know it. "I brought something," she said. She had a cloth sack. She took out 2 biscuits wrapped in flannel, still warm, she'd come from the house. I looked at them, looked at her. She held them out and I took them, and she was watching my face when I did it, and whatever she saw there made something shift in hers, a quiet, careful kind of gladness. Nothing showy, just real. "Eat," she said. I ate one and held the other, and we stood in the fall wind by the north fence line on my 40 acres, with the creek catching the afternoon light in the distance, and I wasn't a man waiting for a tin to be full anymore. I was here, it had happened, I was here. And she had seen me all the way through to it, and she was still standing next to me, and that was the thing. That was the whole thing. The biscuit was warm in my hand. The creek ran on,